Hello, dear audience at the streams at home. A very good morning or whatever time you may wish it to be. This is day 4 of the Privacy Week, Thursday, the 29th of October. If you, for some reason, are you wondering which day it is? It's cold outside, so if you want to stay in, get a tea or a mate, coffee, stay with us, and we'll approach a demanding topic, which is the transition and the change of the labor society. And I'm saying hi to Christina Behran for that. Good afternoon. You may have seen Christina on Monday in our talk about relevancy to the system. Relevance to the system. And the question was, what is relevant? What does that take us? If you haven't seen the panel, of course, you can still see it using the Real Life section on our website, which you find next to the stream. There is a button called Real Life, which you can click, and you then will be taken to the streaming page of the Chaos Computer Club in Germany, and there you find the page for Real Life watching, and you can use your smartphone as well. We have an info desk for questions. We have a cafe, which you will find on the side panel next to the main streaming page. And you can talk to team members there. And if you are joining us via Twitter or Mastodon, you can use this hashtag PW20 or PW20 online, and that you can use to ask your questions. Now, with that, I'm now going to start the talk with Christina. Christina Behran is a freelance clinical and health psychologist. She is also a labor psychologist and a political advisor, and in an earlier life, she was in youth social work as well. You will be talking about digitalization and Industry 4.0, will you? Not quite. I will arrive there. It's about the journey from industrialization to exactly just before 4.0 and all the things that happened, and the importance of finding your location, finding your position, to ask the questions that you can then answer, or that I can answer. And the keyword of the system, to take that up again, it's important to know in which system you are historically as well, for the challenge that is relevant to a particular system, for that to be answered. Otherwise, it won't work. That sounds very interesting and very complex. I'm very much looking forward to the talk. So the stage is yours. Thank you. Well, if you take individual and context as a headline, then I will talk about, as a clinical and health psychologist, I will talk about the fact that I, as a clinical psychologist, have a lot to do with individual matters and worries and problems, where the individual, so the patient, the client, come to me and look for a solution for themselves, in themselves. As a labor psychologist, I am looking at labor conditions to create a context so that employees, to put it romantically, can feel good and can find good conditions. And that is the context that is in focus then. As an organizational psychologist, another hat that I sometimes wear, I watch from the meta level more. And about the subtitle, the transition or revolution of labor society, it's important whether something is transitioning and is a logical development from what was there earlier, or if, because of the speed of a development or a fissure or a breach, there's a real revolution, in this case in labor society. In an earlier life, yeah, that is actually true. I used to work in social work. I was outside, just like a sheriff almost. I would march, and it's a long time ago. In Vienna, I used to do this, and I was young, and I worked with boys, young boys, which are now adults, and the screaming is loud. Great hugs if I meet them, and I have to put myself together and wonder, are these still the guys that I dealt with? And this is a nice story. And I then switched to the scientific level and worked with two wonderful colleagues from sociology and wrote a book that is the foundation of today's talk. And that was mainly about new approaches in educational and employment support. And for young people, it was very resource oriented. And we were ahead of our time. And that was very suitable for me. I'm an absolute freak as far as neurosciences are concerned. Very insightful. And the resource orientation and the potential orientation fitted me and this work very, very well. Now, in the course of this book project, it was an important step for me to find my position and the status quo, in which labor society the young person is. Where can these young people be located? In which framework are they moving in? And among others, it was quite clear that we need a juxtaposition. We need to put things in opposition. And I always had in the back of my head the fact that integration of all of us into society, the participation in society, and you cannot forget that labor is one of the essential factors of participation or integration. That was the case even more in the industrial labor society, but it was an extremely important topic at the time. I remember that the young people that were out of employment they had huge logos on their T-shirts and other clothing. That was a fairly new development, and at the same time, their life story contained a lot of shopping, and we saw that consumption is a way, or an attempt, let's rather say, to participate in society through consumption, through shopping, independent of labor society. And I can remember that this thesis was supported. So young people that were in an apprenticeship to becoming a mechanic, they would then walk up to me in their work clothes and show me that way that they were in a part of labor society and thus in society. So that's the background. And through this table, I'm going to give a kind of instruction. It's a lot of text. Please just look at the capital letters here for the moment. In various shades of gray, we have, in the lightest gray, we have industrial labor society and the structural change of labor society, and the flexible digital labor society in the darkest gray. How do we read this? It's a characterization through these three different stages. And of course, this is a kind of an artificial approach, because these stadia are not just following each other, they are in parallel. And this also applies to the focusing and the characterization of models. And we have these different labor societies, which all have their corresponding political order, how labor looks in the respective labor society, and how integration and participation into this model works, and how the transition looks between these. With the industrial labor society, we also look at the models and the structural changes in labor society is where we will look at the problems that relate to the industrial work society. And in the third stage, the flexible or digital labor society, we look at the approaches that were discussed and are still being discussed about the social conditions of that change, and the fact that maybe you use recipes that apply to the industrial labor society for or on the flexible society, which cannot work. So you can see in a chronological order how these three stages work in parallel and how they overlap, which doesn't make it easier, but now let's go to the industrial labor society and see how what work actually looks like. Today, I think it's important to know that labor was bound to a fixed location. There was a company with a headquarter in a certain country. If you, as an enterprise, had competition, it would be on the national level, and the production of goods itself was for the local, or at most for the national market, and the production within production was done by companies on. They needed a workforce that was local. That was the background, and the labor itself. We had hierarchies there. We have clearly assigned tasks, and it was relatively clear who had to do what. And the historical background was that the time after the Second World War was characterized by an enormous increase in wealth and social security. And industry needed mass labor, which created a certain balance of power between industry and the workforce, but also between labor and capital. And that enabled the creation of a social welfare state, because overproduction made it possible that the state itself acted as an employer or an enterprise. And at the moment when companies had this kind of growth, they could act with very different objectives than the original companies. So that we are talking about state enterprises such as post offices, railways, telecommunication, and these could integrate what you call suboptimal employees. Not a term I coined, but it's a term from 1997. So if you look at the workforce from an economical point of view, then those that were not so much educated maybe come from a social society that is different. That's the definition of suboptimal.
Because the state could act as a corporation with those suboptimal laborers, certain security mechanisms could be created. For example, health insurance, which we will have a closer look at, could be implemented. Now, the transition that took place, it was always clear that school as an institution had the purpose of providing general, to ensure a general fitness for work. Now, a normal working or employment structure, I have a different point of view on that as a psychologist. Well, there is a range, a mid-range, that is to be seen as normal employment, and then there are the edges. A normal working contract is on a contractual basis. You normally have a fixed term, and you have 8 hours of work a day, clear tasks, and also social mechanisms. Full employment is also an important factor, and also economic growth. The background being modernization and economic growth also led to this kind of dream of ever-growing prosperity. That was always the background, and we're still trying to reach this dream, this goal, even though it's outdated. And it's also important to know that, of course, we also had a gender disparity within labor structures, because financial security came from the husband usually working in production. And mothers and wives, on the other hand, had responsibilities at home in the background. And this model doesn't really value women before they are married. And it was seen, men were seen as a failure if they weren't able to provide for a family and be the breadwinner, or after the children had left home. And you can see that a normal biography of a man should not have any breaks or gaps. Still, when you're looking at male CVs today, you have this ideal of going to school, then doing further education, and then entering into the workforce. And normally you don't have a lot of changes of employment. That used to be the normal CV of men. And changes were not appreciated, changes of workplace or other gaps in the CV. A normal female CV or biography would have been building a family. Work, labor, and education were not seen as important for women, or at least not after she had children. And only after the children had left home, women could further their education. So you have discontinuities here. Pluralist roles could be seen as problematic. Women were always seen as belonging to a family and being integrated into society as part of the family. So there wasn't really a possibility to integrate into the workforce. Men, on the other hand, were rather independent from their families. And their role as the breadwinner was very important in society. This was also a marker of status and identity, which they wouldn't have wanted to lose. Institutions and organizations are very hierarchical. You had directors and directors-in-chief and doctors, and of course different statuses were connected with these hierarchical roles. And also participation in society was dependent on what role you had in the hierarchy. You had social milieus, and it was clear, and there weren't really any transgressions or soft borders. It was very clearly divided. Now, looking at the structural change of the 1980s at the latest, I don't know if I said whether it was a change or a shift. I would say that you would rather speak about a shift, because in the late 1980s, we had a very profound change and shift in productivity and labor. That was due to automation and technological developments. The industry was the driving factor here, and economy and politics both globalized, as well as the financial aspects of all of this. And of course, dynamics of power within a labor context shifted in the direction of capitalism. Capital becomes less and less human-centered by automation. If you have globalization, processes become very global, but labor is still local and socially bound. But with structural change within labor context, forms of labor and forms of societal integration change. We have very profound changes in our labor society. When we're talking about the labor society, we're talking about dynamics, and we have a dynamic where societal structures and hierarchies are dissolving and new ones are coming up. That is because industrial processes are slowing down, and economic reality, what is really happening, is changing. And this leads to the problem that structural change indirectly causes a shift away from reality in our labor structures. Now we have challenges in society, of course, institutional challenges, political challenges, and educational challenges. The models we're looking at when we analyze society are often oriented towards labor and the working society, and very economic. Now let's go back for a little bit and look at digitalization of work. Project-bound work is becoming a very important factor here. Successful, innovative industries such as IT have created a new working culture. Projects. Work is becoming a project, is organized as a project with clear roles, and projects have a beginning and an end, and they are always bound to a certain task, to a certain goal. For example, developing a certain product. You always have a team. Sometimes the team is also competing with other teams, and you have to deliver a result at a certain point of time. And this is where flexibility comes in. And whoever completes a project must always be really flexible, and that's not everyone's thing, but it is what companies need and what they want from their employees. And this is not only because of digitalization. It is also important that a job is being done as fast as possible and just good enough to compete with competitors. Competitors are no longer local or national with globalization. And this makes the whole process faster. And this leads, for example, to fluctuating borders within working contexts. Because if you view and live work as a project and you invest all of your resources into the project, and the project being terminated becomes the most important thing. It doesn't matter where. Doesn't matter what your private environment is like. The goal becomes the most important thing. Terminating the project becomes principle, and this is where work-life balances get out of balance. I don't like talking about work and leisure. I prefer talking about work and non-working time, because there's clearly a shift, a transgression, and it is becoming less and less clear when we are at work and when we are at leisure, because we always have our smartphone, we always have our email inbox open, even when we're commuting to work. And you cannot clearly divide between working time and non-working time anymore. And because of these radical changes from an industrial working society to a digital society, you have to reflect on whether this is a change, and it is a question that I would like to reflect further on. Work is digitalized. You can work wherever, whenever. You don't need to be in the office anymore. You can work from home. You can work from other locations. You can even work from other countries. But our market also needs performance at certain points in time. Biographies have changed. People change their employer several times within their lives. And this is also dependent on economic situations. CVs with a lot of different employers are no longer an unusual thing. Okay. What is also important about project-based work is that other skills are required. Not only hard skills are important, but soft skills become more and more important because you have to work in a team. And you also have to be able to get along with new people very quickly, to communicate diplomatically, to network, and to make the best use of your analog and digital networks. Those are skills that are essential in today's working world. Lastly, I would like to talk about the flexible digital working society, labor society we're in. Depending on what aspect you want to stress, I like stressing the flexibility and the skills that you need. Flexibility is a very interesting skill to me, but I also like reflecting on what work actually looks like. Processes of change and structural changes within our working society have impact on our private lives. We have job sharing concepts, for example, flexible, discontinuous working models. Also, universal basic income is something that is often talked about.
But you have to consider that if you are considering integration and people identify themselves through their work, what does it mean if you separate work from income? So you need a different kind of employment model and different integration model. Auxiliary work jobs have died out more or less. So what do you do with these people that were well integrated into a labor society and now cannot be integrated anymore? So that requires self-organization, and not just for the work as a freelancer, as an independent, but also within a company. And of course, you can consider what the labor relationships that we had, difficult enough. You can consider in which column you are. Does my labor relationship correspond most to the normal, in quotes, relationship? Does it have a flexible project character, or is it work-life blending, where life and work time aren't really separated anymore? And what's important is, if we come back to the individual, we've looked at the large framework, the large context for a while in which that all happens. Work-life balance would be a nice thing. And the balance, of course, if that is in the foreground, the individual is in the foreground, and you always strive for an individually balanced relationship between work and private life. As I said, I'm no longer talking about work and non-work time, and just by no longer talking about it, one can see that how much has changed there. And if you ask how you can then get this balance into your life, you have to know in which system you are moving. And in order to get a balance of the individual in that context, please, I'll tell you, consider the balance within the person, the balance with that person's environment, in which, of course, labor is a central element. And I'm skipping through these a bit more quickly. I have to watch for time. There is a concept where work-life balance isn't really used. We're talking about life domain balance, which I find much more agreeable, much more useful, because there are various areas in life that you need to put into a balance, not just work and non-work. Also, times for home office and other challenges, and you can still take this a bit further. What's important is the creation or the maintenance of life quality. So recreation, very important. And I always say that that also entails that if you want what you want, and this is my penultimate slide, just so that you know, how should work conditions, through all the columns that we looked at, how should work conditions really be? Work should be doable. It should not cause damages. It should be free of impediments, and ideally it should further health. And if these factors and these potentials are not possible, then you need to look for improvements. And that is a concept you can see from 1980, but it's still very true. And there is a hierarchy. What I would prefer most would be for us to have a work that is doable, doesn't damage you, and that, of course, suits the personality and that has potential for development or frees those potentials. And labor and organizational psychology looks at these issues, and we are looking at these issues at the moment, the dimensions. What does the current situation mean for the challenges and the activities? What do they mean for the social and organizational climate, for the work environment that no longer is the office, not exclusively at least? And what does it mean that work processes and work organization change? And many, many different questions and questions, but a lot stays the same as well. I rushed things a bit at the end, but I would like to keep to the time restrictions. And that's fantastic. Thank you so much for the talk. Please don't be confused. We've just heard from the backstage that we could hear you perfectly, but we could not see you. But we have a beautiful photo that we've prepared of you, so we can continue talking. And there is a question: has a cultural shift already happened, or have the requirements just changed? And have we maybe not changed economy accordingly? Talking of depression, for example. Yes, that is a very good question. And that is where the talk was supposed to go. And that's what we should deal with. Do we actually have a different culture? Does it make a difference whether I have a normal employment relationship, which is designed, to put it bluntly, you could try to construct it in your head. What happens with the normal relationship or the industrial work is that you have an 8-hour workday with a lunch break in between. You do that work, you then close the office and go home, and that's it. And then my spare time starts. And to see if work and life outside of work can be balanced, that is a very different issue to when you have a structural change or you've moved into a framework that requires absolute flexibility, including home office. You have different ingredients there, but the needs are the same. And that's why recreation was in one of my slides, because I find it so important that the following, even if it's self-evident, has to be said. Recreation means you start from a relaxed energy level, then you work, and energy becomes less, So I have to recreate, to go back on this level. And the factors that contribute to me recreating or relaxing are different in a flexible labor society than they were in an industrial labor society, the kind of work that conform to one of these models. Yeah, this mixing of this intermingling of work and private, and what is work time, what is spare time, not just for companies, it makes things more difficult, as I said, but also for the individual. So that had to be separated quite consciously. That's something we need to learn. I am a freelancer in digital communications. Since 1993, by the way, I've long given up to separate personally between what is work and what is private. And, well, you keep saying, make your hobby into your profession. That is the case. I have two hobbies. One of them is music, and the other is digital communication. And both of these I also do professionally. I do professionally. So I consciously try to free certain times in which I do not approach a work context intimately. I cannot switch it off completely. If I read communication, I am not going to say I'm in non-work mode now, so I'm not going to read this. So that's not the way I separate it. But my question is, do you have tips, recommendations, how one can learn this separation and how to make it clearer personally? What should you prepare for in the next few years as an employee to create this clearer separation, also regarding your colleagues and employers? We'll have to reinvent a few things, but that separation is hard, and because we're still aligned to say this is work, I'm now going to close the door, and now I'm in spare time mode. And I think this model of life domain balance about the different domains in life that change, I think that's important. They are not always equal. We need to be flexible there too. And I can only recommend, if I'm asked for a recommendation, this is a curse and a blessing as well, both. And if you can do something very well, then if you're very good at not switching off until you're really exhausted, it's important to find out where your own resources are and what recharges you. Of course, there has to be a separation that is helpful, but often the reality in the life means that you cannot separate it from your work. That has to be in parallel, such as a subtitle. I don't know, maybe you can set an alarm, and every 50 minutes perhaps, from a neuropsychological point of view, if you are very focused, there is a certain area of your brain that is active, which needs a lot of energy. And after 15 minutes, at most, we have the need to recreate, to take a break. So you can set an alarm for that, and you have to deal with that as a different reality as we had, say, 20, 15 years ago. Resource orientation. Where do I recharge?
Definitely. We're currently discussing about specialist economist. I'm a specialist for media and communication. And you also said that soft skills are very essential right now. So those are things that aren't taught in schools, but we need desperately. So do you have an idea or a wish towards schools and universities? How could we prepare young people better for today's working world? Well, I was almost in the process of developing a education schedule. It is always important to know how you yourself function. So this would be very important to me because we have so many outside influences, so many worries in our heads, and so much input from outside that we have to deal with. So what we should really learn is how to deal with all of that, how to reflect, and how to find yourself in the middle of all those influences. Well, let's hope for the best. Of course, it is my personal opinion that what I just stated, that that anxiety is rising and all that. So thank you very much. We don't have any questions from the internet, but still you will be available in the break room, so that if people are interested, they can get in touch with you. You can find it on the streaming website. There's a link here on the desktop or below if you're using your smartphone. You can find the break room, click the break room, and then you can connect with our speaker. So thank you again for taking the time. And we will assist you in finding and dealing with the break room. So thank you very much.